Another election, another case of voter fraud. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. Listen to this headline, shocking, and the word shocking is in quotation marks as if somebody's saying it. Shocking fraud on video prompts judge to toss election outcome in Connecticut's largest city. That is not from the past. That is November 2nd, 2023. A headline from the Daily Signal in a piece written by Fred Lucas. So here we go again, right? Here we go once again. Election season rolls around and we all have to worry, bite our fingernails and wait and see what's the next case of fraud that's going to come forward. Just days before a scheduled general election in Connecticut's largest city, Fred Lucas writes, a judge threw out the results of a primary election for mayor, citing, quote, shocking, end quote, evidence of voter fraud caught on video. In 10 years from now, are we even going to have elections in this country? Or will the integrity have fallen so low that people don't even want to vote anymore? Before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, where I would point you to signing up for my 3 times a week newsletter. It comes out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's called Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. And you can get my newsletter by going to the bottom of the page at washingtontimes.com, finding the newsletter section, clicking on it, and signing up for it. All you have to do is put in your email, and you'll have delivered Monday, Wednesday, and Friday right to your email box my commentaries that I write every day at the Washington Times, as well as the bonus of my Tuesday and Thursday Bold and Blunt podcasts. So you don't have to go look for them everywhere else. But in case you just want to find podcasts that are similar to Bold and Blunt, check out Real Life Network. That is the faith-based news outreach platform of Pastor Jack Hibbs out in California. Bold and Blunt is among its lineup, but they have also a ton of other great podcasts and video blogs that you definitely want to pay attention to. But guess what? You can get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are offered. Back to this piece from the Daily Signal. Democrats' September primary in Bridgeport, Connecticut, pitted incumbent Mayor Joe Ganim, G-A-N-I-M, against challenger John Gomez, maybe, the city's former chief administrative officer. Gomes at first appeared to have won, but after absentee ballots were counted, Ganim won by 251 votes out of 8,173 cast. That's what the Associated Press reported. Now back to Fred's piece. A surveillance camera showed individuals stuffing multiple absentee ballots into a ballot drop box at night. Sounds familiar. Where have we seen those videos before? I can't think. It was so long ago, 2020. Lawyers for the city of Bridgeport argued that it didn't prove illegal voting took place. Lawyers for the city of Bridgeport, you gotta love these lawyers, right? Argued that it didn't prove illegal voting took place because, illegal stuffing of ballots in the dead of night. What's to see here? Go home, folks. There's nothing odd about that. You have to wonder, how hard a job is it as an attorney sometimes, right? Because you take on a client and then you find out details about the client's case that maybe you didn't know up front, or maybe you're just really hard pressed for money. So how hard is it for an attorney to take some of these cases and actually stand before a judge or stand before a jury and judge and with a straight face argue something so silly as to say that just because people were pulling up to drop boxes in the dead of night and just shoving ballots in it, that it doesn't mean anything illegal took place? No. Anyhow, that's a new talent for attorneys, right? Being able to argue cases without bursting out laughing. When those cases they're arguing, even they know deep down, and maybe not even so deep down, maybe right there on the surface, are ridiculous. However, Connecticut, back to this piece, Connecticut Superior Court Judge William Clark disagreed. There's an understatement, huh? Disagreed. How polite. The videos Clark wrote in his ruling, the videos are shocking to the court and should be shocking to all the parties, meaning all the parties should be disagreeing with these attorneys who argue nothing to see here, folks, go home. The judge added that, and this is a quote again from the ruling, to disregard the significant mishandling of ballots by partisans that were caught on video flouting the provisions of Connecticut law would endorse the blatant practice of ballot harvesting. We're barely into election season and boom, busted, right? On video. Election fraud. The Associated Press reported that Bridgeport voters still will vote in the general election November 7th, but will have to return at a later date for a new primary election to pick the rightful Democrat nominee for mayor. The judge said he lacked the authority to postpone or cancel the general election. In this heavily Democrat city, the party's primary likely would determine the winner of the mayor's race. So here we are, election season. How secure do you feel when you go to the ballot box that your votes are going to be accurately counted? I know a lot of states, a lot of localities, since 2020 have undergone a lot of election reform, right? Cleaning up, getting rid of all the dead people, for instance, on the voter rolls, and securing ballot boxes and discontinuing the practice of allowing 24-hour ballot boxes to be stationed at certain points around the communities for anybody, anytime, to just go stuff some votes in there. But really what we need to move to in this country, and I think I'm in the minority here, but we really need to move back to fighting for election day. You know, we've moved so far beyond that point in time where there was just an election day in this country and where people would vote on election day, save for the very few who had reasons not to, such as the military with the absentee ballots, right? If you're overseas, I was overseas once, had to vote overseas. If you're overseas in the military, you're allowed to vote absentee. If you're ailing or sick, handicapped, right? You have a built-in valid reason for voting early or doing a mail-in vote. But if you simply just want to go on vacation, or you check the weather report and you see that it's going to be rainy on election day and you don't feel like doing it, that's not a good excuse. To me, it detracts from the somber occasion of voting. You know, not all countries elect people. Some countries just bring leadership in by military coup. Who has the strongest military, or who's able to seize the control at any given time. But here in this country, for a very long time, we've had very orderly election days. And it's only been over the last couple decades, and you can track this, and I have tracked this in previous Bold and Blunt podcasts, and I have also written about it for the Washington Times and other places as well. We've had this alarming sort of shift from election day to election days to election week to election month to getting to the point of just nonstop elections where people can't even, they don't even know what candidates are running and when. We have elections in May, we have elections in November, we have special referendum elections, and then of course we have the general elections and the presidential elections, and campaign season for the presidential elections, for crying out loud, start pretty much as soon as Inauguration Day is ended. And so it's this endless cycle of elections and campaigning, which in the hands of the media, right, create this narrative that we always have to be on the lookout for the next candidate. We need to have the newest candidate out there. And so everybody announces early, and then the media flocks to cover all the candidates who are out there and to do so fair and balanced and so forth. And it's just one nonstop election cycle after another. Voting should be just restricted to election day, except in the rarest of special circumstances. Because what that does is it forces voters to realize, first and foremost, that voting is something to be taken seriously. It's not like running down the grocery store and picking up a chocolate cake and some spare ribs or something, or pork chops to cook for dinner, and just stopping by and tossing your ballot in the box. It's something that you should think about. It's something that as the day approaches, that you should be vetting carefully the candidates that will be on your ballot, whether it's local, state, or federal. So you should go into election day, into the election line, into the ballot box, in mind with what candidates are going to represent your beliefs, hopefully your constitutional beliefs. It's not something that you should just do as a check item. It's something that you should put some thought into. But second off, election day also removes a lot of the fraud that can occur. If you have to physically show up and there are paper ballots that actually have to, under watch of voting people, right? Voting officials, you have to fill out your paper ballot and put it into the machine, then there aren't a lot of steps there where corruption or fraud can occur. But if you're allowed to just toss your ballot into a box as you're walking down the street, at a specially set up spot for ballot boxes, then you can have dead of night stuffing of ballots. And those things are supposed to be validated, right? They're supposed to be signatures and are then supposed to be validated and so forth. And they're supposed to be checked against lists to make sure that dead people aren't voting. But the problem is that doesn't happen, right? We don't do a lot of the due diligence that we're supposed to. Part of it is because negligence, but a bigger part is because election fraud and election month versus election day plays into the designs of Democrats, who know that they cannot win on the principles they represent if they're honest about those principles, so they have to take matters into their own hands. And with the Democrats, we've seen, just most recently in Connecticut, that it doesn't matter what means you do, what means you use, so long as the ends are achieved. And if it means lying and deceiving and stuffing ballots into boxes in the dead of night and hiring attorneys to argue with straight faces in court to judges that nothing to see here, that doesn't mean anything, then, well, so be it. That's what Democrats will do. And Republicans, sadly, may not involve themselves as much as Democrats do in election fraud, but they enable the fraud to go forth because they're reluctant to call it out. Look at what happens when Carrie Lake talks about election fraud, or Donald Trump talks about election fraud. Even members of their own party, the Republican Party, want them to shut up about it. They don't want it talked about. So that's the sad and sorry commentary here, that Democrats love election month, never-ending elections, mail-in balloting, absentee balloting, and so forth and so on, because it gives them the tools they need to commit election fraud. And Republicans don't want to talk about election fraud because they're afraid that it will upset the delicate system that we currently have in place that is only growing more and more delicate. My guest is Fred Lucas. He has written the book, The Myth of Voter Suppression, The Left's Assault on Clean Elections. And boy, what a timely book as we head into 2024 presidential elections that are already turbulent, because we have Donald Trump, of course, being thrown into court left and right by the deep state Democrats, who would hate to see this America First man take over the White House again. Fred, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It is great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So your book, The Myth of Voter Suppression, The Left's Assault on Clean Elections, very timely, coming as it does on the cusp of another White House run. What led you to write this book, first off, and what were some of the astonishing findings?
Well, one of the big things is after almost half the states in the country passed some type of election reform law in 2021, we had Democrats all over the country. Elizabeth Warren in D.C., Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and elsewhere saying Jim Crow 2.0 about these laws. President Biden said Jim Eagle. Nobody's figured that out yet completely, but he was attacking these election reform laws. What they essentially did was extend voter ID requirements to absentee balloting, and also put restrictions, if not outright bans, on ballot harvesting. So, and that is something that Democrats really have invested a lot in, is more ballot harvesting, more mail-in balloting, and so there's some basic common sense election integrity restraints on that, and they worked. None of these restraints prevented people from voting. We saw a very good turnout in 2022. Previously, really over the last 2 decades, as more states started adopting voter ID laws, we never saw these dire predictions that Democrats had made that it would suppress turnout. And something I get into a lot in the book is that you basically have sort of this voter suppression hysteria industrial complex of these various left-wing organizations, such as the Brennan Center out of New York, that hypes up this mythical problem, evidence-free problem. Of course, Verified Action. Stacey Abrams turned her 2018 loss in Georgia into a industry and forming all these organizations pushing this myth. So ultimately, and if I could compare also the problems of voter fraud to voter suppression, in modern times there are no real cases of no adjudicated cases of voter suppression. You can't really find the plaintiff. You have organizations, again, like the Brennan Center, Verified Action, that will point to disparate impact studies of some sort, saying this proves that such and such law suppresses the vote. They can't produce a plaintiff who says, I'm a legally eligible voter and I was prevented from voting.
Right.
Whereas, by contrast, there are numerous cases of voter fraud in which elections have been overturned. Election results have been overturned. There was a congressional race in 2018 that was overturned. Mayor's races, state legislative races that were overturned. People have gone to jail and been convicted in voter fraud cases. So we know voter fraud is real, and there is no evidence of voter suppression in modern times.
I want to get into the whys of why Democrats, it seems, drum up this hysteria. But first, I want to go back to what you said a minute ago about harvesting ballots. Clarify what that is and why it's so bad for election integrity.
That is the biggest problem, I think. Ballot harvesting is when political operatives can collect large sums of ballots from election offices and then distribute these ballots out. The book, The Myth of Voter Suppression, has a whole chapter just on ballot harvesting and various corruption cases that were involved here. And it's really just an open door for voter intimidation. These political operatives, sometimes they're unions, other organizations also, just go into people's houses, deliver a ballot, and then stand over them as they're voting. Often they know how they're voting. Or there's also been cases which people go into nursing homes, instruct people who might not be fully aware of what's going on, how to vote. And I mean, this just opens the door for corruption. It undermines the secret ballot as well. And I might want to talk about the secret ballot in a little while, too, because there are some historical comparisons between that and voter ID. But, ballot harvesting is just kind of wide open for fraud and voter fraud and voter intimidation.
So why does it seem like Democrats want to drum up this hysteria as if voter suppression is going on and it's Jim Crow America once again? Toward what end?
It seems that Democrats don't want anything. Have always opposed any election integrity laws, and this almost goes way back. Democrats have talked about. Made this slander of Jim Crow 2.0. First of all, no one should forget that the real Jim Crow, that was entirely a Democratic Party project. And also, while Democrats had Jim Crow going on, they also had Tammany Hall going on in New York and various other political machines going on all across the country at the big city level. And the goal was pretty much the same, whether it was Tammany Hall or Jim Crow, and that was subvert and corrupt election laws to make it easier for the Democratic Party to get elected and win elections and then pass their laws to perpetuate this machine. And I don't think it's very much different right now, and they use this hyperbole right now.
And you found in your book, The Myth of Voter Suppression, that it's not just the Brennan Center and the usual 501c groups that are pushing the idea of voter suppression, but big tech actually is involved in that as well. Talk about what you found there.
Well, yeah, big tech, a lot of the big tech companies are actually involved in and some of the nonprofits they're affiliated with, have been involved in funding this organization called the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence. Now, what's important about this alliance is it's made up of of numerous organizations. However, the chief organization that's running it is the Center for Tech and Civic Life, which was the main group that was getting Mark Zuckerberg's funding in the 2020 election. Now, what this alliance says they want to do is that they want to get into local election offices and from there teach best practices. That sounds ever so nice, but you look at who is funding this, first big tech, but it's also being funded by Arabella groups, and that's a dark money, left-wing dark money network that has like numerous organizations all across the country, and it's trying to basically get in and teach best practices that would be beneficial to one party over the other.
So over the last few years, over the last few election cycles, we've seen this, in my view, alarming trend, an uptick in mail-in balloting and early voting for no reason. It used to be limited to, say, just the military or those who would be out of state at the time of election or elderly, handicapped, and so forth. And now it's pretty much anyone, anytime can vote early and mail in their ballots. Republicans, sadly, are on board with this idea. So do you see this trend? First off, what is so problematic about it in your own words? And second off, since Republicans have jumped aboard this, do you see it reeling back any? Do you see us ever going back to a day where it's just election day and you have to go to the polls to vote?
Yeah, a lot of people say we have election month instead of election day now. But yeah, I think that's going to be hard. People, just in general, like convenience, and that is a hard case to make. I mean, we're in agreement on this point, but at the same time, politically, it's a hard case to make to people. Just as on the positive side, on the upside, about 80% of the public across all demographics, partisan demographics, racial demographics, and so forth, really support voter ID. Big majorities on every demographic there, and overall 80% support voter ID. So conservatives have won on that front. They haven't been able to win, and basically, as you said, they're caving in on the issue of early voting and more mail-in voting, because that can be a tough case to make when people, if if you ask the average person, they would like to be able to vote on their iPhone. I think a lot of people know that, that would present all types of complications because you don't know who could hack that type of vote and so forth. So, unfortunately, I don't know how we pull that back in terms of mass mail-in voting.
Did you do any look back analysis at the 2020 election at all, or is yours more just okay?
I do try to look forward, but this is also a history book in a lot of ways. And there is a chapter on the 2020 election, and I did try to look at what has been determined because this has come out, I think, more recently than some of the other books on the 2020 election. So it does. We look at what has been definitely determined in terms of there was a Wisconsin special counsel investigation into how the Zuckerberg money was spent. A look at how the election laws were changed in states like Pennsylvania, primarily in a very unconstitutional way, and also we'll look at how the Zuckerberg money ended up kind of pumping up the vote in a lot of these states and how it might have been different.
So would you say, based on your research into that presidential election, that Americans by and large should feel comfortable with Joe Biden in the White House, or going forward, should we have flags being raised over the election results that led Joe Biden to be in the White House?
Oh, there should definitely be flags here. There's it's not easy to determine whether the outcome was wrong per se out of 2020. What we can say though, I think without dispute, is that election laws and election procedures were changed in 2020 for the purpose of benefiting one candidate and one party over another, and that happened on a broad scale. And those election law changes did not just come out of the blue over this pandemic. People didn't just think these up. These were things that Democrats have been pushing for decades, mass mail-in voting and so forth, and more ballot harvesting. And so they got much of what they wanted, almost everything they wanted in 2020. And most of what happened in 2021 was kind of reeling that back in, the return to normalcy.
So have we reached that return to normalcy, or should we have the same concerns for 2024's election?
Well, I think it's going to be better. I think a lot of these laws about some supervision, back to the mail-in balloting, that's something that's a train that's left the station probably. At the same time, at least there's going to be some supervision with that. At least there's going to be voter ID extended to that, same as it would be with in-person voting. And at least in a lot of states, we've reined in, we've pulled back on ballot harvesting. And that's very important.
Okay, so just wrapping up with the last question or two here, Fred. People reading your book, what are the most important chapters or most important points that you would like to shed light on for the coming elections in 2024? If people are looking for warnings, if they're looking for what they need to avoid or what they need to do, what do you point out in your book?
Yeah, there is the Myth of Voter Suppression. Has a chapter on ballot harvesting. That's still a huge problem throughout the country. It's not banned in every state as it really should be. I have one chapter. Actually, the conclusion is called "Defeating Tammany Hall 2.0," and that goes into some of the solutions, which would be probably I'm very cautious about having the federal government get involved in elections, but in this case, I think there could be an interstate interest in banning private dollars like what we saw with Zuckerberg from an election administration. And I also, if perhaps some sort of restriction, at least if not outright ban, on ballot harvesting. There's a chapter that goes in detail about the truth about the election reforms that were made in states like Georgia, Arizona, and Texas, and it looks at the lies that the left told about these laws and then the actual truth on point by point. So I would encourage readers to check that out as well.
And I assume Amazon and wherever books are available, people can buy.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all those places.
Okay, Fred Lucas, I want to thank you so much for writing The Myth of Voter Suppression, the left's assault on clean elections. I appreciate your research, and thank you for taking the time on Bold and Blunt.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And that's another Bold and Blunt. If you like Bold and Blunt, don't forget you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, at WashingtonTimes.com, and wherever podcasts are offered. If you are a subscriber, I want to thank you. Thank you very much for supporting my podcast. And the Washington Times thanks you as well. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.